The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Lord Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, invites you to attend our virtual seminar on Understanding China's Challenge to the International Order, which will address China's growing role in the world and how global communities might wisely respond to it. The event will be moderated by former BBC Asia correspondent Humphrey Hawksley, and panelists include T. Stams, Charles Parton, Professor Jinggan Zheng, Howard Zhang. The webinar will open with an introduction to the topic by Lord Bruce, closing remarks by Barry Gardiner MP, Chair of the Democracy Forum.
Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this fascinating Democracy Forum seminar, Understanding China's Challenge to the International Order. Now, the current US-led international order, for want of a better phraseology, was born out of the catastrophe of war about 75 years ago, and it is creaking at the seams. There's a new kid on the block with new ideas. It wants a bigger seat at the table. It's testing boundaries. And if it doesn't get that seat, it's talking about setting up its own system. The antagonism with America about a trade war a few years back has now become an ideological war of democracy versus autocracy. Which system delivers best for you? Billions of people are asking that all over the world. And for us in the liberal West, is this a bad challenge that threatens our existence or a good one that makes us sharpen our game? We've got an incredibly insightful panel with us today. Charlie Parton, a Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, will talk about how the domestic agenda in China is setting the foreign agenda that we're feeling all over the world at the moment. And Charlie's various papers are sitting in Cabinet Office desks to try to forge a new strategic policy that Britain has towards China. Professor Jinghan Zhang, Professor of China and International Studies at Lancaster University's Confucius Institute, is talking to us from Chongqing. And he's going to talk about the COVID pandemic and China's growing ideological confidence. T. Stams, Research Fellow at Netherlands Institute of International Relations, he's going to shed some light on why the Chinese Communist Party believes it needs to sow doubt into the resilience and sustainability of our system here, the open societies, the liberal democracies. And Howard Zhang, chief editor and head of BBC Chinese, he's going to look at a fascinating topic of how China's state-sponsored propaganda machine functions on social media and the impact that has on the overseas diaspora, the tens of millions of Chinese students and business people and families that live outside of China. We're going to have a summing up by Barry Gardiner, the chairman of the Democracy Forum, member of parliament, former shadow international trade secretary, who is going to wrap and conclude in his usually compelling and incisive way. But first, I would like to hand the screen over to a message from Lord Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum.
Welcome to this video-enhanced seminar, which the Democracy Forum is hosting this afternoon. For those of you who attend our webinars or regularly read our monthly publication, Asian Affairs Magazine, you will be aware of our continual focus on China's international presence. Last year we organized a review of the Belt and Road Initiative, but a seminar which we had planned in May to expose China's treatment of its minorities was cancelled owing to the pandemic. Today, our panelists will consider the strategic objectives that lie behind China's foreign policy and the consequences for global trade and security. These issues feature widely in the current edition of Asian Affairs magazine, where the editorial asks when and to what extent Beijing plans to oust America as the global leader and create a new world order, anchored with its own autocratic form of governance. This, perhaps, is the crux of what we will be discussing today. The Chinese government has always been quick to reassure the world about its foreign policy intentions. 2 years ago, in September 2018, we learned from Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, that the Belt and Road Initiative is neither a Marshall Plan nor a geostrategic concept. Rather, it amounted to no more than an attempt to build a community with a shared future for mankind, together with other countries around the world. An economic cooperation initiative, not a geopolitical or military alliance. However, this is a view which is becoming less and less tenable. In a defiant attack on China at the World Economic Forum at Davos in 2019, the philanthropist George Soros felt sufficiently uninhibited to refer to President Xi Jinping as the most dangerous opponent of open societies. In calling for a collective and measured response to Xi Jinping, Soros argued that an effective policy towards China cannot be reduced to a slogan. It needs to be far more sophisticated, detailed, and practical. But ultimately, the essential challenge for the international community in the face of Chinese aggression is to maintain a collective front. China is expert at breaking the unity of an alliance by offering inducements to the weakest link, concludes the Financial Times' Gideon Rachman. This year, however, we are witnessing a collective pushback by the international community in the wake of China's failure to stem the outbreak of the pandemic or control its spread overseas. At the 73rd World Health Assembly, held in May, a draft resolution tabled by the European Union and Australia called for an international investigation into the outbreak of COVID-19. Although China opposed a motion calling for Taiwan to be granted observer status, it agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Another interesting development in the global community's response to growing Chinese hegemony was debated at a conference this summer hosted by the Indian-based Law and Society Alliance. Panelists noted the scale and extent of current Chinese territorial aggression on its land and marine borders, affecting many countries in addition to India, including Nepal, Bhutan, Taiwan, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Speaker after speaker concurred that India should fully change direction and challenge the one China approach that has underwritten its foreign policy for decades, using the very regions which China has encroached as a diplomatic weapon against it. And in a further ratcheting of rhetorical defiance, United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made the symbolic choice of the Richard M. Nixon Presidential Library to deliver a speech on China in July. In stark contrast to Nixon's blithe optimism, which followed his celebrated meeting with Chairman Mao in 1972, Pompeo urged the international community to stand firm against intimidation. To secure our freedoms from a Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time, he declared ominously. Welcome to the webinar. I hope you will be enlightened and entertained by our panelists. I thank them all for participating, and particularly to Humphrey Hawksley for yet again agreeing to act as your intrepid chairman.
Thank you. A message there from Lord Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, focusing very much on the role of the Chinese Communist Party, both internally and domestically, now that it's beginning to impact on all our lives. And that's why we're now going first to Charlie Parton to set the scene on that. Charlie's work has been gone deeply into the workings of the Chinese Communist Party, and there is no better person to tell us about that than Charlie Parton. The screen is yours, Charlie.
Thank you, Humphrey, for that dose of exaggeration. So I'm going to look at the domestic background to foreign policy. Foreign policy is domestic policy played out abroad. That's the same for all countries. If you want an example from the UK, just think of Brexit and how that sort of those domestic reasons for Brexit have affected our foreign policy relationships. But I think it's just as so often with the case of China, it's even more so when it comes to the Middle Kingdom and to the Chinese Communist Party. And before I get into the sort of theory of it, let me give you an illustration by taking the Belt and Road Initiative, which, as we all know, is merely a slogan. But behind it lies a very important reality, which is what I describe as globalization with Chinese Communist Party characteristics. That is extremely important. And Xi Jinping has described this as the main plank of his foreign policy, and indeed it has become so, and it has accreted geopolitical and other baggage as it's gone along. But I think it's worth returning to the origin of the policy, which in fact was by a Chinese scholar called Wang Jise. Back in 2012, I think he published a paper called Marching Westwards, the rebalancing of China's geostrategy. And although that has a very foreign policy title, if you look at the motivations or the justifications, the four justifications that he puts for this change in policy, they all are deeply, deeply embedded in domestic considerations. And I would label those as six, building on his four. I mean, firstly, obviously the economy, employment and stability, which requires resources, new markets, technological investment from overseas. And if you look at the original Belt and Road, the land routes, the original ones all went through and ended up to the Middle East, where there are considerable oil resources. So I think that that economic motivation is obviously key. Another one is help with the overcapacity industries. Again, just to try to alleviate the problems of employment back in China, but at least it would allow a breathing space for new high-tech industries in China to develop, but meanwhile continue to help the country's economy progress. Thirdly, one of the things that Wang Jise talks about is closing the income gap between east and west provinces of China. If you spend your time, as I do, looking at Chinese documents, you will see that this business of income gap, whether it's between individuals, between the country and the urban centers, or between the regions, is regarded by the Communist Party as absolutely crucial to its survival. Fourthly, developing Xinjiang. The policy had been in the early, and it's somewhat changed recently, but it still underlies it, that economic prosperity will eventually dampen any desire for extremism, for religion or cultural autonomy. This is has become, I suppose, even more important in the light of what's gone on in Xinjiang. But that economic prosperity is one arm of trying to sinify or sinicize the region. And then moving on from that, fifthly, another thing that lies strongly behind the original Belt and Road concept is the need to develop and stabilize the countries just across the border, the so-called stans, because that would help neutralize any effect of extremism or instability flowing back into Xinjiang and affecting the party's hold there. And sixthly, I would say that again, behind the Belt and Road is the need to diversify and perhaps get a better rate of return on foreign exchange holdings. I think in those days the idea of the internationalization of the renminbi was not quite on the radar as it is now. However, in practical, that's going to prove in the long term, but that's another question. So I think that the BRI gives you a good illustration that it's domestically motivated in its origins. Of course, it grows from that. But that's the way foreign policy very much is for the Communist Party. Now, to step back from that and to look a little bit more at the theory, I would say that the very obvious point, let's start with the very obvious point, that the main aim of the Chinese Communist Party is to retain its monopoly power. And the threats to that, obviously, are just as everything good stems from the Communist Party, so everything bad that happens in China may be laid at its door. It's extremely important to retain power, because if you lose it, that is very bad for your health. You don't just go on the lucrative lecture tour in the US or wait to the next election. Now, if you doubt, and some have, when I've said this sort of thing, that's the Communist Party's main aim, people say, oh, well, I think you exaggerate. Well, I just refer you to what State Councillor Dai Bingguo said in 2010, and this is one of China's top 50 people, when he said, what are China's core interests? My personal understanding is, first, China's form of government and political system and stability, namely the leadership of the Communist Party of China, the socialist system, and socialism with Chinese characteristics, i.e. staying in power. So in order to stay in power, and it's necessary to avoid instability, which would be directed at the Communist Party. And therefore the Communist Party spends much of its waking hours legitimizing its power. Legitimacy can't, of course, come from the ballot box, but what it does come from is what I call the 6 legitimacies. Now, this is my expression based on the Communist Party love of a number and then a noun to describe some very long, complicated thoughts. But the 6 legitimacies are very much domestic, but they play out in foreign policy too. Foreign policy must be in line and serve them. So what are these 6 legitimacies, and how do they affect foreign policy? And so I would say that you could describe them as only the Chinese Communist Party can ensure, and then we have 6 things. First of all, continuing economic prosperity. That is by far the most important, and I've just described, when I talked about the Belt and Road, much that bears that out. So I won't go into any further detail on that. But it is by far the biggest. As long as prosperity continues, then I think that the people will accept the monopoly of power at the Communist Party as generally a good thing. Secondly, so the second legitimacy is it's China. It's only the Communist Party can ensure that China is back in its rightful place at the center of the world and end a century of bullying. This is a very common theme throughout China. It may be nonsense, because China's never been at the center of the world. There was no center of the world perhaps until the early 1800s, and then China was in no place to be at the center of it. But that's in many ways irrelevant. But what it means in terms of in domestic is a propaganda campaign which shows that the Communist Party has gained world respect, is back where it should be. And in practice, in foreign policy terms, that means China and the Communist Party seeking a much greater role in global governance and international organizations. It's seen a projection of the nationalism that it uses domestically to legitimize itself. And it's what lies behind the assertive, if not bullying, diplomacy that we've seen in the last few years, not least with the so-called wolf warriors. That plays back well inside China. China has stood up. It's become great again. Thirdly, the third sort of legitimacy and often replayed theme within China relates to territorial integrity. So we got the Communist Party and has ensured that. We got Xinjiang back in 1950, we got Tibet back, Hong Kong, Macau are now back in the fold, and the South China Sea and Taiwan are surely irresistibly and inevitably following. Again, this is based on myth, but it doesn't matter. I mean, for instance, the claims to the South China Sea are based on a map from about 1947 or 48, I forget, of no legal validity whatsoever. And Taiwan has only been controlled from Beijing directly for 4 years in its entire existence, from 45 to 49. Never mind, that is what is pushed out And that is something that the nationalism within China that's stimulated by the Communist Party finds very gratifying, and it's a powerful theme. It does mean, though, that there is, when it comes to abroad, room for a lot of clash of values and a clash in some practical things. So none of our relations with China, or our country's relations with China, can ignore the business of what goes on in Hong Kong or what goes on in the South China Sea, and the adherence to international law there, or what happens or might happen in the case of Taiwan. So again, maybe something that fortifies domestic legitimacy, but it sure as hell has a very large effect on our foreign relations. Fourthly, respect for Chinese culture. Only the Chinese Communist Party can ensure respect for Chinese culture as the world, as it goes out into the world. But note that culture in China, in the Chinese Communist Party lexicon, actually is very much more concerned with ideology and coarse socialist values. If you spend your time looking at work reports from the Communist Party, you'll notice how in the last few years, under the culture section, ideology and socialist core values have moved up. They're usually about 7, 8, 9 sections. And whereas it used to be 7th, 8th or 9th, it's now number 1, 2. It's extremely important. And it's extremely important that this ideology is the wrong word, because I don't think China is seeking to change the rest of the world into its own form of ideology in terms of a consultative Leninist system, but it is seeking to change the world's set of values and norms, because as China globalizes, as it has more students, it has more business, has more tourists, the global relations get ever thicker, COVID permitting, then the sorts of values that are outside in the world, which are frequently described by the Chinese Communist Party as hostile Western values, flow back into China. So the more you can change those norms and values abroad, the less that threat is of that backflow. So I think that also is an important influence on the way that China approaches its foreign policy. The fifth legitimacy that the party puts out is, we have the best form of governance. I mean, look what happened to communism under the Soviet Union, disaster, and same in Eastern Europe. And as for democracy, need I say more, Xi Jinping might argue, and does argue, than Brexit and Mr. Trump. And there are times when one sympathizes with that view. But that I think that, again, this does affect the way foreign relations are played out. If you take the example of the propaganda over COVID, it was that was played out abroad. So there was a domestic campaign and an external campaign. And the external campaign was a disaster if you look at it in terms of the way foreign countries reacted to it and the change that it has wrought on the attitudes of foreign countries towards China and the Communist Party. And I think in the longer term, that has really stimulated many countries to reassess their foreign policies towards China. But then we weren't the main aim of that external propaganda campaign. The Chinese people were. And the first, because of the mistakes of the Communist Party made in the initial transmission in the early days of the coronavirus, that meant that they had to scramble to gain lost ground, which they did, both by very successful means of controlling the disease within their own country, but also presenting themselves as the savior of the world, as we saw, asking the European Union to keep quiet about the help that the Union gave to China, but then making a very loud noise about any help that was forthcoming later. So the best form of governance, very important domestically, but it does affect abroad. And finally, the sixth legitimacy that I always talk about is a much more difficult one, but one that Xi Jinping is forced upon him. I mean, he talks about the three critical battles or three critical struggles as part of the domestic scene. And he talks especially about poverty alleviation and the environment. Now, in a sense, poverty alleviation I've covered already under the when I discussed income gap. It is a big threat, that to the party. But the environment is also a big threat to stability and to the longevity of the Communist Party. And that was brought home to me very clearly in 2015 when I took the new EU ambassador, or I accompanied him anyway, to see the one of the ministers at the International Liaison Department, and it got him to ask, what are the main threats facing China? And it was very interesting because the minister said the income gap, rural differences, and the environment. If we don't solve those, the party is finished. And the environment is a tough one. Now, is this relevant to the world? Well, of course it is, through climate change. And I would assert that actually the Communist Party doesn't care about climate change. It's too far in advance. Of course, it's good for the propaganda. It's good that America is backed out of leadership. But the actual performance, if you see truth from facts in terms of the climate change, is pretty lacking. Again, I don't think that matters, because what really matters is pollution. And the Chinese Communist Party is doing its best to solve pollution, particularly in air, but also in water and soil. And that's good for all of us. That's good for the world. If they tackle it bottom upwards by going hard on pollution, then that's very welcome, because that will help climate change in the long run. So that again will affect our policy. I'm probably running near my time, so I will just end by saying that much as sometimes people think that I'm quite hawkish on the subject of the Chinese Communist Party, in the strategy paper that I wrote back in June on how the UK should work its way towards a new strategy and policy in its relations with China, I think the most important point is that we are very keen to seek the best possible relations with China. I don't believe that D stands for decoupling. Inevitably, it stands for divergence in a number of fields. And there, I think the most important thing for us to do is to work out, is to see clearly the difference, the gap between rhetoric and reality. We have the rhetoric of win-win, Belt and Road, community of shared destiny, and all that. But please, let's be aware of the reality, which is talk of hostile foreign values. Xi Jinping's first Politburo speech in 2013, a scene setter, includes a number of very interesting phrases, but he talks about a prolonged struggle for Chinese socialism to gain the dominant position against Western capitalism. That's how he sees it. So we should be aware of that. And that was followed not that long later, 3 months later in April, by the infamous document number 9, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but it basically repudiates every single important Western value upon which our whole society and the way that the world has been built for the last relatively peaceful 70 years, since 75 years since the Second World War. So I think we need to be aware of that. At the same time, we have to maximize our good relationship. So it's not going to be easy in the future as we work that out. But we won't work it out successfully unless we keep a very clear mind on what the Communist Party actually is, rather than what we would wish it to be.
Charlie, thank you for that analysis. We've got some nice comments coming in, praising your insightfulness there. And I just wanted to say that each of the speakers is going to be talking for around 10 to 15 minutes, after which we're going to open it up to questions and comments. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a comment box. Type what you want. We'll put some of them up. We might put all of them up, and then we will bunch them together for questions at the end. Charlie, I'd just like to pick up on one of your legitimacies, if nailed down on them, is that the Xinjiang camp issue is likely to be one of those things that flares up into our 24-hour news cycle if something goes wrong there, and there's a sort of cost to human life in that. You've also worked in North Africa and the Middle East. The Western democracy, the Western world order, tried to end terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere without much success. the camps themselves, the legitimacy that China puts on it is that it is to stop extremism and terrorism. Can you bridge that gap somewhere for us as to their argument and our argument, which might be morally legitimate but didn't have great results?
Well, I wouldn't put myself forward as an expert on terrorism, Humphrey, but I think there is a real difference here, that there really was and has been a very great deal of genuine terrorism throughout the Middle East, Africa, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And although there have been incidents in Xinjiang, it's, I think, very difficult to conceive ETIM as the sort of effective terrorist machine that AQ and AQIM and others have been elsewhere. And that there's a great deal of exaggeration. I'm not saying that China should not be well aware of an intention there, but I think it's possible to control its borders, and more importantly, its inside, particularly under new technology and new surveillance, without going to the immense effort, if I may put it in that somewhat strange way, of locking up over 1 million people in concentration camps, and all the other paraphernalia of surveillance and repression. There were 1 or 2 incidents in China, the Kunming railway station, the explosion in Tiananmen, etc. There was, of course, the outbreak of violence in 2009 in Xinjiang. But was that as much terrorism? I think it was far more disharmony caused by the policies that China had been implementing in Xinjiang, and which caused Uyghurs and other minorities simply to boil over. So, the line is that
not legitimate then, under our views, there is no legitimacy at all to these camps. I mean, the reason
I think it's largely an excuse that is being used. I think it would be perfectly possible to control extremism through measures that were 1,000 times short of the repression that's been put on. And the question is whether in the long term this will not be counterproductive, because it surely must alienate most of the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others from China. Whether they will ever, China would say, well, there hasn't been an incident in the last 3 years of terrorism. And that's, from that aspect, you could say, well, true. But if ever the pressure releases, it may be quite unpleasant.
Great. Thank you for that, because that dovetails nicely in a way to Thies Dams, who's going to be talking to us about how China's sowing doubt into our communities in the West. And interestingly, that there was a vote, I think, that you would know about, Thies, in the United Nations on the Xinjiang camps and Hong Kong and these issues, whereby China was able to gather about twice as many votes as the Western democracies in its favor. And then we also have here in Europe the illiberal democracies, Hungary, Poland, and that, which is sort of veering towards China. So tell us, please, about sowing doubt about the resilience and sustainability of our open societies. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate it, and love the Democracy Forum is doing great things. So this is, I think, a particularly interesting topic to me. I'm a philosopher by training, who got into following China later on. And so I like to look at geopolitics, not just in the material sense, adding up the calculus of bombs and hacks and at the ideological sides as well, and especially the narrative sides. And I think understanding China's mistrust of the concept of an open society has a couple of reasons behind it, and it's very important to understand it. The first and obvious reason is deeply historic. Of course, the Opium Wars have traumatized the Chinese state up until this very day. It's been kept alive as a memory of the way openness as an aggressive or an offensive concept can infringe upon the freedoms and the stability of China and of countries in general. So I think we shouldn't underestimate, and I would think that in the United Kingdom that would happen a bit less than in the Netherlands, but I do notice in the Netherlands that this is a debate we often need to have. We shouldn't underestimate the historic mistrust of openness as a concept within the Chinese state. But I think to relate it to the current situation, it's also these are related. It's mainly coming forward from a defensive and geopolitical perspective. I think China has learned to see the open society or liberalism and the international order as not something neutral, but rather as a means to getting other countries to do to act in a certain way or to change their country, to change their state apparatus. So it's very distrustful of.
Have we lost Thies there? Are we hearing Thies at all?
I think I'm back here.
Thank you. Thank you. I was worried for a moment. Please carry on. It's very interesting.
Sure. So this self-image of China as a humiliated superpower, as a fallen star, has everything to do with its mistrust of the open society, as it feels it was humiliated historically by a very offensive kind of an aggressive kind of openness used by Western powers. But it's also had to rise again within an international order that wasn't neutral, but was deeply ideological in its view, because of its ideal of the open society as a sort of exemplar of development. And I think in the end there's a philosophical reason for the Chinese state to not trust the open society, and it has something to do with this notion of neutrality, that it somehow builds forward on neutral or universal ideals. I think it's deeply distrustful of that kind of universalism. It emphasizes diversity and historicity, so that the fact that every country is different, that every state is legitimate in its representation of a country's or a culture's differentness, and that universalism isn't it's a philosophical.
Have we lost you again, Thies?
Oh, that's not good. I'm back.
Where are you? Are you in Europe?
I am in Europe, yes.
Oh, goodness. We better get the Wi-Fi up and running. Maybe we should get Huawei in to fix it.
I think we're well on our way here in Holland.
Okay. Sorry, carry on.
I hope it'll stay on. It was fine up until now, but that was always happens. So I think it sees openness as necessary, chaotic, as fragile, and as offensive, and that doesn't add up to our image of it. I think there's a big clash between the open society as an ideal and how it is viewed in China and the West. But I think the real danger is asking how we deal with it are a couple of layers of irony in our reaction to China's position towards the open society. I think, first of all, China is ironically becoming the kind of enemy of the open society that we fear it's going to be, because in large respects, it is trying to defend itself against it. So it is becoming more interfering, although it is claiming to be the superpower that won't interfere. It's becoming more offensive, although it's probably or mainly becoming more offensive from defensive motives, and is becoming more propagandistic. While its story is that every country should respect and maintain its own cultural and ideological diversity and identity. So there's a large amount of irony in China's defense against what it sees as the hegemonic ideal of the open society, and again in our reaction to China, because of course we are or at least some political strains within the West are by becoming more and more hawkish, distrustful, and ideological against China, and arguing for decoupling from China, are reinforcing the bad image of the open society that China is building upon, and so encouraging China to become the kind of rival or maybe even enemy we fear, and by reacting to that, we're trying by aiming to becoming stronger in that relationship to China. We also run the risk of sacrificing our own openness by becoming more protectionist, by becoming more distrustful of international order, by becoming more distrustful of our own partners and other open societies. And so there's this vicious cycle wherein China and the West are fighting for ideals, but the only ultimate loser in the end is the open society. And I think the big question in engaging with China and China's distrust, historic distrust, geopolitical distrust, philosophical distrust of the open society, is how to break that cycle. So I like a quote by Karl Popper, and then I'll end. Of course, maybe the most rigorous defender of the open society in history, who said, "We must go into the unknown courageously and using what reason we have to plan for security and freedom." And so what he said was, at times that the open society is most under threat, both by distrust abroad and distrust at home, and especially in times where those types of distrust are mutually reinforcing, we shouldn't become defensive or reactive, but we should innovate. And I think that's a perspective often lacking in the kinds of policy questions that are raised by China's rise. So the debate often goes towards how should we judge China and how should we increase our defenses towards China's interference. Whereas most big strategic questions that China's rise asks of us is to ask us to innovate our own systems to become competitive within China towards China's rise, and to stop being reactive. I think Popper knew that decades ago, almost a century ago, and his thoughts may do well to resonate today. We should innovate rather than become defensive, and try to break at least some of the cycle of distrust and distrust in the open society, because we might well lose the thing we're trying to protect. I'll end there.
Geez, thank you very much for that. I wonder if I could probe a little bit more with you, because this distrust and innovation sort of has captured my own interest over the past few years. And Europe itself has proven to be a little bit fragile when it's come to dealing with China, muddled through, I would say, as to whether it invests in our power stations or whether we send carrier groups to the South China Sea. We don't quite know. We had the statement about a year ago about it being a systemic rival, which seemed to move things around a bit. But we've also got the 16, now 17 plus 12 economic expansion into Central and Eastern Europe and Greece. It's a big issue, but I wondered if you could sort of compress that for us into how vulnerable is Europe to China's expansion? And does Europe have a united policy that could, I think, as you say, not distrust it, but innovate how to manage this encroaching power?
Yes, that is a big question and a very relevant one, and I think I can at best partially answer it, but I would love to give it a try. I think Europe might be as vulnerable as it chooses to be in the coming years, meaning that no aspect of China's rise is bound to be an existential threat to the European Union, but its continuing lack of united foreign policy, as well as a certain how to say, I think, blandness towards its own ideals within its own borders, make it very vulnerable. So to put it more specifically, I think it does need to strike some better deals in its diplomatic relationship with China, and it has to do that by acting more in a more united way, and it can't do that within the current structure. So it needs at some point to move towards either qualified majority voting on foreign policy issues, or to form subgroups with like-minded countries within the EU, and especially in its relation to China, that's going to be incredibly important. But I think it can also do, and that's a bit more philosophical, but I think actually it can be very practical as well. It needs to tell its own story better. So I think it has for a long time relied on world history to move towards the ideals that it holds dear, the ideals of the open society, and especially I think what gives China lots of breeding ground or lots of opportunities to sow discord within the EU is the fact that we've defended and propagated those ideals in a very very poorly or very in a very poorly in the last decade. So we need to re-engage the European narrative, not just to tell it to the world, but to tell it to Europe. I think a parallel can be brought to the European elections, where to the last American elections, where all the bad things you can say about Trump. One American politician noted that Trump brought a story where Mrs. Clinton brought a spreadsheet, and there's a point to that to relate to the EU as well. Where's the story that tells us what Europe will bring for the coming decades, and what it might bring to Europeans and to the world? It's lacking, and it's becoming more and more urgent to answer it, because actually China is telling that story, and it's not just about China; it's about us as well.
China's telling a better story than we're telling.
Yeah, at least it is trying to tell a story.
It's a more captivating story. I mean, I'd just like to nail down that before we move to Chongqing from here, is that you actually said we need to tell the European story to the European people and the world, but also that the structures within the European Union at the moment cannot handle something like, or the rise of China, indeed the rise of any power. It's not structured to handle that in its present form. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think the requirement to have a unanimous agreement on foreign policy issues within the EU member states makes it incredibly difficult. I mean, so we've seen this in the past where, for instance, Greece or later Hungary would vote against, for instance, condemning China for human rights violations, thereby stopping all of Europe speaking about this within the UN. And I think the main issue isn't that's stopping China from changing, because I think that's maybe far too naive to believe anyway. But it is undermining Europe as an ideal, and Europe as a credible moral partner, I guess. And so these structures can't answer that. And similarly, I mean, the old joke by Henry Kissinger, in times of crisis, who do you call in Europe, still applies. And maybe, maybe on call.
We know to call Xi Jinping, but we don't know who to call in
the red telephone. But more importantly, Joseph Borrell, the EU High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, has spoken about the battle of narratives. But a narrative needs a narrator, and Europe needs to have a face telling. If it wants to join that battle, it needs to have someone telling that story. And right now.
That's brilliant, because thank you, because I want to take this now to Chon Ching. In fact, I switched around the panelists, some of you might have noticed, because I wanted to hear you, Thies, and then get the view from Professor Jinghan Zheng, who's in Chongqing at the moment, as I mentioned. He's from the Lancaster University Confucius Institute, but he is going to talk about the COVID situation, but also China's growing ideological confidence, exactly what we've been discussing here, of how the Chinese cultural, political values are moving into Europe and elsewhere. So, Professor Zheng, the screen is yours. We have lost link with him, so hopefully we'll be back. So Howard Zhang, are you available before I announce what brilliant stuff you're going to tell us? Because Howard, chief editor and head of the BBC Chinese, is going to explain to us how China's state-sponsored propaganda machine functions, which I think is fascinating to us all in this social media age, and the impact that it has on the millions of Chinese students studying abroad, families, business people. Howard, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you. And actually, my topic follows on the previous two speakers' topic quite well. In a way, there are three components or three elements to today's topic. One is, what is China's propaganda, and what is the propaganda machine, and how is the modern day now new phenomenon, social media platforms, is helping it to spread its information, and it's still gaining more influence overseas, especially within the Chinese diaspora overseas. So those are the three parts to my talk. And before I go into all that, I just want to say, because there's quite a bit of information I want to give, I will balance the needs of people who are already experts in these areas and on those topics, and those ones who are not that familiar with the topic of China and social media. And the aims, for example, of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, similar to what Charlie said at the very beginning, it's essentially to self-preservation purposes. And there's so many main themes, and its ultimate aim, in one sentence, is to say the Chinese Communist Party is good, is doing a good job, you should keep us in power, and look at the scary, bad world out there. Without us, that's what you're going to have. That's essentially the message they're trying to tell. And but before I go deeper into the methodology and the machinery of this propaganda story and how to tell the China story, I want to give you a quick short video. And this short video was made by New York Times a couple of years back, and it gives you a glimpse of what the internet and social media is like inside China at this moment. Vinit.
If you are sitting in the United States or Europe right now, you've probably never used a Chinese app. But the reality is, if you want to know how the internet will develop, China, the land once known for its cheap ripoffs, has actually become a guide to the future. You know, the internet is the internet, but for China, the internet is more like an intranet. It's largely walled off from the Western world by this incredibly complex system of filters and blocks that we call the Great Firewall. And basically, the Great Firewall blocks any foreign site the Communist Party doesn't think it can control. So that means there is no Facebook, no Twitter, no Google. Instead, what filled the internet vacuum was a generation of Chinese copycats that have grown into huge companies. So for Google, you had Baidu. For YouTube, you had Youku. For Twitter, you had Sina Weibo, and the list goes on and on. It's almost as if the Chinese internet is a lagoon as an aside to the greater ocean of the internet. And in that lagoon, there are these swamp monster apps that bear some resemblance to the creatures in the ocean, but are mutated in some ways because they evolved in a different kind of environment. But things have started to shift in the sense that before, no one outside of the lagoon really cared about the swamp monsters. But now all of a sudden, some of the features they've developed are so amazing that Western apps are trying to copy them. And the greatest example of this is WeChat. WeChat is an example of, for lack of a better word, a super app. It's a Swiss Army knife that basically does everything for you. It's your WhatsApp, Facebook, Skype, and Uber. It's your Amazon, Instagram, Venmo, and Tinder. But it's other things we don't even have apps for. There are hospitals that have built out whole appointment booking systems. There are investment services. There are even heat maps that show how crowded a place is, be it your favorite shopping mall or a popular tourist site. The list of services goes on basically forever. But it's not the variety of things you can do on WeChat that makes it so powerful. It's the fact that they're all in one app. So why does that matter? Hypothetically, imagine you're sitting at home and one day you notice your corgi is dirty. You open WeChat, hit a few buttons, and a few hours later a man shows up at your door with some shampoo and a big vacuum. Your dog gets cleaned and he looks great. You take a photo, you share it with your friends, and tag the dog cleaning business. You haven't left the app. Your friend who likes Hello Kitty and works a boring office job is slacking off at work and looking at WeChat. She sees the photo of your clean corgi. She decides she wants her poodle cleaned. She clicks the tag on your photo and orders the same service. Within seconds, the man with the big vacuum is on his way to her house. She pays him, and he's happy because he got paid instantly on WeChat. She starts chatting with you to thank you. Neither of you have left the app. While chatting, she tells you about a new hip noodle joint. She says, you have to come. It's a schlep, but you accept. She orders food while still at her desk. You order a taxi. She pays for the food. On the way to her house, the man with the big vacuum invests the money he earned from both of you into a wealth management product that's probably a little too risky. Neither of you nor the man with the big vacuum have left the app.
Okay, just say this is a section of the video, and the video goes on to explain that this super app is both an utopia and a dystopia. And to gain all the facilities, to the all the things you can enjoy in life, all the easy going about, you have to sacrifice your data, your privacy, and the government, which is omnipresent in China, will be on hand to help themselves to all these data. So it's a trade-off, and that brings us to the topic of what the Chinese overall propaganda machine is all about. It is about self-preservation for the Communist Party. And can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So on the second slide, we're looking at two posters. Well, actually, one picture poster. The first poster, for those of us who are old enough, who probably remember, back in the 1960s, when Mao started his Cultural Revolution, and the propaganda of that time was that under the great helmsman, workers of the world unite, and he is the red sun, he is the savior of the working class all over the world. And that's the type of why forever correct, eternally bright Communist Party you have to follow. And nowadays, in today's world, that type of message will be difficult to spread easily within even China. And the message start to morph into smarter ways, such as after COVID, faced with a disaster, the Communist Party's propaganda machine somehow turned it around into a victory under a supreme and decisive leader, and we've defeated the illness, the virus in China. And this is a celebratory parade inside China, and it's televised live on television, online, and on social media. And can we go to the next slide, please? to build up this message of success, forever righteous and correct and brave Communist Party leading the nation, and to avenge all the humiliation of the past hundred some years, some of these common themes. And there is a machinery and there's a mechanism, and they work on. The machinery on the top of it, of course, as we can see from the top picture, is many call Mr. Big, or President Xi Jinping, and also his right-hand man, the propaganda czar, Mr. Wang Huning. The tools they use, or the weapons they use, and according to American-based Freedom House, they've summarized into 3 types of weapons. First is propaganda, by expanding Chinese state media, by cultivating foreign outlets that will produce content that's pro-Beijing, and or either directly or indirectly buy up foreign media, and also to spread, using various platforms, disinformation. And the example we can give is during the Hong Kong protest, and also during the COVID coverage. We've seen lots of disinformation in Hong Kong. Instead of reporting properly the debate, the arguments, the focus is solely on what they quote-unquote violent rioters and destroying properties and threatening people's life. And that almost gave the government no choice but to send in troops or army to crack down. And that was the type of, and it was spread through the megaphone of not only state media, but all the social media accounts. So that was just one of the examples. Then domestically, and now increasingly overseas, is the censorship bit. And censorship in domestically, it's helped by the control of data and monitoring. Some of the monitoring systems used in China, every few thousand IP addresses, they're actually dedicated, what they call the internet safety monitors, who actually watch the screens of hundreds of people at the same time. Anyone who post anything that what they call the sensitive words are likely to be identified or warned. And if you're a journalist or a critic of the government who constantly come up with things, then before long, you'll probably have a knock on the door from someone. And after censorship, of course, they also have a content delivery side. Essentially is to fill the vacuum of this vast and massive space now exists in social media. There's never enough content. And if you can produce the most digital content to fill it not only on Chinese platforms such as WeChat and Weibo, but you can also go now further on to YouTube, to Twitter, to other platforms. If you have enough, and to make sure you always have more content than your competitors, than the competing voices, then you have the edge. So those are the 3 legs of the giant Chinese influence or propaganda machine stand on. And at this very moment, Vinit, can we play the second video? There's a little short video just to show you how what's it like to actually, since we touched on the topic of censorship, to live under the censorship inside China. So Vinny, can we?
Officials in your neighborhood may knock your door because they want to know what's the reason behind your behavior by posting so much sensitive words. I'm Caroline Kan, a journalist and author living in Beijing. If you are a company operating in China, you definitely don't want to make the government angry. As a condition to operate in China, you have to obey the Chinese law. If they don't censor certain content, then they might face the punishment by the government, saying you are not obeying the law and the regulation. And as a big company, they certainly don't want to take such risk. So those companies actually do a lot of self-censorship. Some obvious terms like the top Chinese leader's name or some history events like June 4th are obviously banned in China's social media. Maybe those certain words you already know you probably don't want to use on your social media. Even you say something really positive about a government leader, but you kind of, by saying that, posting that, you kind of got the attention, and people don't want that attention from the authority. Of course, you can choose to, for example, send a so-called sensitive word to your friend, but then you have to face the consequence.
Thank you, Vinit. So this builds on the censorship part of the machine, out of the three legs. And besides monitoring, intimidation, more and more increasingly in the digital media space, we're seeing armies of government-controlled trolls start to cyber attack, as well as offer mainly verbal online abuse to anyone, and trying to crowd out the information that the government deems not welcoming. And occasionally, in the case of Hong Kong protests, we've seen reports and cited physical assaults after. And if for example, a local journalist who reported on certain things, and then before you know, somebody would have stopped the person in the street in the dark, and a few people would lay on him. So those type of things all form part and part of the propaganda machine. And the picture we're looking at too is mainly about the delivery now part of the propaganda. Back in 2016, the Chinese government launched a very ambitious program. It was called the Great Overseas Propaganda Campaign. Here, I have to say the very word propaganda in Chinese, especially in the Communist Party's lingo, was not necessarily a bad word. People often say it, well, that's media's job, state media's job, to propagate what the party considers a correct thought, a politically correct thought. So that's their job. And only after being reminded by international scholars saying, actually, this is not necessarily a good word when you come to the West, do they now start to change the word into more of a public relations or a publicity into other words. But for a long time, the Ministry of Propaganda was just called Ministry of Propaganda. And so back in 2016, the government of Xi Jinping actually allocated, this is actually open source information, 60 billion yuan, which is the equivalent about 6 billion pounds per year, for the few giant state media organizations, including that time known as CCTV, China Central Television, and globally as China Global TV Network, or CGTN, to expand their service to the world. And CGTN now has a fairly good-sized bureau office in Chiswick Park in London, and as well as in many parts of Europe, Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, and Americas. It's essentially used this money to spread its wings. Besides CGTN, we also have the Xinhua News, or the China Central News, as well as China Daily. Many of the state-sponsored, government-controlled media outlets are spreading their wings worldwide. And now we go on to the next slide, please. Okay. What we're looking at here, besides the state media, now with new technology, the Chinese propaganda machine is increasingly moving on to the areas of social media. And besides actual monitors, they also have with the help and open collaboration from major platforms, AI-assisted data surveillance. And this is an open secret, even in China. Any Chinese who uses their Chinese-made apps or software, people know. As we watched in the short 1-minute BBC video about what's it like to live under the censorship. If you post a word, sometimes you don't even know what you posted, but you already triggered some type of a monitor, and your data are automatically, without your knowledge, collected, and could one day build up a case against you. And I have actually a personal experience recently over one of those apps that's currently in hot contention, and the U.S. government is trying to ban it in the U.S. and we'll come to it later on. And I was trying to text using that app someone inside China, a colleague, and with something very trivial. After I received a response, then before I know, my account was frozen. And after much investigation, then I realized the person who replied attached a certain picture, that the picture itself was deemed sensitive, and it was later on, automatically triggered a block of my account. And so who, besides the AI, we actually have live person. In the bottom right picture, you see, this is actually a picture of a award ceremony of what they called model online safety monitors. And many estimate that China, through its various branches of propaganda and online monitoring agencies, employed anywhere between 2 to 3 million online safety monitors. And they do the job of monitoring people's communications, and also by sometimes commenting, posting in comment, and or posting disinformation, misinformation to lead public opinion to a certain sway. And so there's an active army out there doing, besides state media, helping state media and forming a ever greater force of influence. And can we move to the next page, please? Next slide. And this is also posted actually by Chinese state media. Again, a training course run for what many call, the 50 Cent Brigade. The name 50 Cent Brigade came about because it was rumored that many of these online safety monitors, when they post a comment in a controversial post or somewhere, they're paid 50 Chinese cent. Whether that's true or not, that I don't have confirmation on that, but that's the common name known by the Chinese netizens. They call them the 50 Cent Brigade, and they come in swarms. If they see, for example, a dissident overseas who posted a piece of information that may cause the government embarrassment, then before long, literally within minutes, you will see hundreds of posts and comments, sometimes in the thousands, descending on that post, and includes direct personal attacks, and also threat. I've seen people, using really obscene languages, and for example, even the state media, some of their direct posts recently called the U.S. State Secretary Pompeo, quote unquote, fat pig, and that's actually a moderate word, a moderate phrase they used towards, just because they did slight one of Pompeo's speeches, and then you followed on hundreds of personal attacks right on top of his Twitter comment. And we move on to the next page, please. Yeah. And what's the impact of the spread of Chinese propaganda overseas, especially on Chinese-owned social platforms. If we remember the first video about how easy it is to live within the greater super app environment of WeChat, many Chinese, even overseas diaspora, because of their close connections with families and friends back home, and if you frequently travel to China nowadays, without WeChat, it's difficult to even book a taxi or go into restaurants. And many places no longer accept cash. And everything is done within the super app. Because the environment extends from within China to worldwide communities, people tend not to even venture out of that app. That's the danger now we start to see of these type of social platforms. They look at outset, it's just a user-friendly app, and you can buy your shoppings cheaply, get all the things you need, even when you're living in Vancouver. And the two pictures we're seeing here, back in 2019, during the Hong Kong protest, these are students and emigre Chinese diaspora population living in Canada and the UK. Instead of watching and listening to the impartial news of mainstream media, they still live within the platform of WeChat and Weibo. And so the type of information they got led them to believe in what the government is saying, that Hong Kong is occupied by rioters and the government is legitimate to crack down. So they started going out into Leicester Square, this is Trafalgar Square, and also in downtown Vancouver, to wave the communist flag, the Chinese flag, and call for support for Beijing government. And some of the gatherings, the numbers are actually in their thousands. And that shows you just a glimpse of the impact some of these Chinese social apps are having, and their impact overseas. And now can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. Besides the Chinese social platforms, we see more and more now on even the traditional mainstream.
Howard, could I just jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we've been trying to get Professor Zheng backwards and forwards. He's just come up.
Yeah.
And could we bring him in now before we lose him again and then return to you?
Sure.
I do apologize. Professor Zheng, the screen is yours. Thank you for your efforts in coming back.
I'm very sorry that my connection wasn't very good. I am actually talking to you from China at the moment, and the network in my network on my broadband after 10 p.m. tends to be very weak. So sorry about that. I'm very glad to be able to join today's panel. I think I'd like to talk about China's growing confidence. But before we come to that, I understand that today's topic is China and a global order. And for me, the first question to ask about that is, what is global order and who decides rules and norms in the current global order? And as Humphrey introduced, the current US crafted international order is shaking. And the common narrative is that China is the one who is shaking the global order. China is the revisionist power who wants to change, if not overthrow, the global international order. But I think I'd like to raise a few points and questions about this common narrative in the West. The first thing is, it's not only about China who wants to change this global order. China's challenge to the global order is not unique. Perhaps it should be understood in the wider context of BRICS. It's about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa together. They are not happy with the existing rules crafted by the United States. And you can fairly argue that it was decided under the unipolar world back 2 decades ago, which failed to reflect the international reality. And we all know that nowadays we are going through a global power transition. The power is shifting from the west to the east, from the north to the south, and China lies right in the center of this global power transition. And it's believed that, meaning in China, that the current global norms and rules fail to reflect the Chinese interests. And this is a position shared by many in the BRICS country as well. So those BRICS countries, or the rising countries, or you can call them the non-Western power, they are all dissatisfied with the existing liberal international order in many ways. I'm not suggesting that they are a coherent group. Neither will they be able to provide alternative global order, but there is a shared dissatisfaction over the current international order, which we should notice when we talk about any challenge to the existing order. And this is quite normal because the global order is always shifting. It's not static. So we have to bear in mind about that. This is natural reflection of the shifting global international landscape. The only concern I'm having is whether this dynamic power transition process is going to be peaceful or not. Previous speaker has addressed some of the issues in Taiwan, in South China Sea, which I believe are quite concerning, and I think that all parties should be responsible for it. The second point I like to mention is when we talk about China's challenge to the international order, it's quite important to note that currently the biggest threat to the international order is not China. I would argue it's probably the United States. The unpredictable, nationalistic, and entirely instrumental leadership of Donald Trump is quite damaging to the international order. And the Trump administration seems not to be believing global governance, multilateralism, and this reflects in his position towards trade, towards WHO in the middle of the pandemic. So all of that seems to be posing quite a big threat to the global order. And if you approach that from US-China relation perspective, and it's quite ironic to say that China probably is the one who wants to maintain the status quo, which you can say about China's commitment towards the United Nations, and China's commitment to a lot of international organizations, including WHO. So in this regard, is really the narrative that China is a representational power, US is a status quo power, correct? It's probably not. It's probably the opposite. And we have to notice that in November, in the United States, it's going to be presidential elections. And before that, there seems to be a lot of dramatic and a series of political actions being taken in regards to US-China relations. So for example, now there is a discussion about clean network, discussion about banning China's TikTok and WeChat in the United States, and banning Alibaba. And there's a big push towards the so-called decoupling US-China relations. And why all of this has to take place in such a short period of time, I think this is quite a dangerous move and potentially bad for the entire world. And back to the first point I made, really, the security challenge to change the status quo in the East Asia in a very short period of time is very concerning, and it might evoke a Chinese response and escalate a Chinese response in which quite concerning to everyone. So that's a wider context of the China and the international order. And I like to talk about China's ideological confidence. I'd like to argue that in the past few years and probably in the past few months, you can see a very clear growing Chinese ideological confidence about its political system, about its ideological values. And in the West, this has often been framed as China's normative challenge to the existing global order. It has been argued that China has been exporting its values, political systems, which is putting a threat to the American liberal democracy. As an academic, I find this discussion quite interesting because every time when I talk to my students about liberal democracy and evolution of political system, and if you go back to 1980s, the discussion about the political system was very different. Back in late 1980s, democracy was hailed as the end point of ideological revolution and evolution, and American liberal democracy was hailed as the final form of the government. At that time, we have witnessed the collapse of Eastern European communist regimes, and many believe that in the future there will only be one political system, that is American liberal democracy, and all the other forms of government will die, and then everybody will evolve into that. And now we have seen a very different world and a very different discussion. And why shall we be worrying about the liberal democracy being threatened. I think there should be some reflection over the problems of liberal democracy itself. And back in then, the 1980s, China also was really concerned about what might be going on in regard to the third wave of democratization. And Deng Xiaoping suggested to the Chinese Communist Party that China probably should keep a low profile in order to survive this period. In his own word, it's called keep a low profile, never seek for the leadership. That has been considered as China's grand strategy in the past few decades. But perhaps now you can argue that this is no longer the case. Since 2012, China has obviously shifted its grand strategy towards a more proactive approach to look for leadership. And it was argued within China that the current keeping a low profile no longer suits China's purpose, given China's size. And China wants to take more global leadership. And all of this has been evidenced by China's increasing funding to United Nations and support to WHO, etc., etc. And within China, there was also a big push for ideological confidence as well. And in Xi Jinping's 3 confidence theory, later changed to 4 confidence, it's firm confidence in its past, which means China's modernization, China's own path to modernization, not the Western way, and firm confidence in theory, Marxist-Leninist theory, and firm confidence in political system, which is China's political system, and firm confidence in Chinese culture. Some of that has been addressed by Charlie's 6 legitimacy discussion, so I wouldn't want to repeat many of that. But I think in general, you can summarize there is a growing focus on socialist ideology and the Communist Party's monopoly on power. And at that time, honestly, not everyone liked it. But I would argue there are 2 big factors recently changed China's growing ideological confidence, and more people now believe in that. The first one is really Trump. Since 2016, when Trump administration won the election, his own personal style, outspoken comments on American media, judicial independence, and American politics in general really lead to many reflections in China about liberal democracy. American liberal democracy once beheld as the lighthouse, the city upon the hill. But when Trump became the president, and so many problems, all sorts of kind of social problems created during his leadership, has led to many Chinese reflect about whether the American liberal democracy is perfect as it claimed, and it has become quite unattractive to many Chinese people. And the second major factor has been changing and making Chinese more ideologically confident, I would argue, is currently what's going on, the pandemic. We have to be honest that at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a self-reflection within China about its political system. But when the pandemic arrives at Europe and the United States, the way how the Western government has been responding to it make many in China start to reflect. And I was in Britain from January to July this year, and I witnessed the entire process of how the UK has been watching the situation, the pandemic, and then deal with the pandemic by itself. And then after July, I come to China at the moment, and I can compare it of both way of the Chinese response and British response, not only because I'm an academic, but also as a personal observation. It's quite a big difference, I would argue. And in China, if you talk to a lot of people, they would say that the incapability of Western government in responding to this public health crisis makes them feel that the Chinese way is probably the right way. And when you talk to them, a lot of them would refer to the blame game among different Western parties, the slow response in the pandemic, and incorporation within and without the Western government. And all of that make Chinese people and Chinese officials very confused. In their original minds, the Western society supposed to be a model for other developing countries, and developed countries like United States and United Kingdom supposed to have much better medical resources, much advanced medical technology, much better medical system. So they should be able to much better to cope with the pandemic. But instead, we have seen a very different picture. So all of that kind of understanding of probably illusion has been trumped by the COVID. And when they saw that the rising number of the infected cases in the West, and this has been narrated very well in China, and many Chinese people start to become more and more confident about their own political system. And now, personally, I have been in China since July, and everything go back. What I have seen is things go back to normal. Restaurant is open, karaoke is open, nightclub open, and people start to take mask off. This is quite different from what I have seen in Britain at least a few months ago. And the Chinese government take a very strict and forceful policy towards COVID. And also people take it very seriously as well. And there is a high level of compliance with the government policy. And you can pretty much argue that the Chinese government policy towards COVID-19 is quite popular in China. And this is why many people start to reflect about the pros and cons of liberal democracy and China's own centralized political system and the capacity of mass mobilization. Many would argue that China's centralized political system and high level of mass mobilization capacity is better to protect and secure Chinese people's interests, their health and safety, at least when you're facing a major pandemic. And we all have to bear in mind that the wider question for that, I was thinking, is when liberal democracy doesn't work, then what shall we do? Probably you should frame it another way, is if the public cannot act in their own interests, what should government do? And I think this is something debatable, but at least the Chinese answer is very clear. The Chinese answer is that if the public cannot act in their own interests, and they need an authoritarian regime comes in with a centralized system, mass grassroots mobilization to get the job done in order to protect the public interests. I understand that this might not be popular approach in the West, but at least this is quite popular in China. And all of this contribute to a growing Chinese confidence about China's political system. So I would argue in the future, we're going to see the growing competition about over cultural and political values. This might not necessarily be a bad thing, because neither our values nor political system is static. It all needs to be changed. Just to summarize what I'm trying to say, I think that first of all, China's challenge to the international order is not unique. It's a natural reflection of China's growing power, and it's not only China. It's all the rising power, including BRICS. And the current biggest threat to international order shouldn't be China. You can pretty much argue the lack of commitment to global leadership and the global governance in the United States might putting a bigger challenge to the international order. And then I argue that Trump administration and also the pandemic really contributes, are the two big factors contribute to the growing confidence of China. I think I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to welcome comments, questions, and critiques. Thank you.
Professor Zheng, thank you so much for that. There's a lot of stuff to take out of that, and thank you for your perseverance in getting back to us from Chongqing. But before we go on, I'd like to go back to Howard, who was coming to the end of his address with another video slide. So Howard, the screen is back to you again.
All right. Okay. Hi, Vinit. Can we have the flag waving slides back? All right. Okay. So just before we interrupted a little bit about what we were talking about through these new apps and social media, a lot of Chinese, especially young diaspora, who are living and working, studying overseas in the UK, in Canada, US, but they're still very much living within the same environment as they did back in China. And hence, when controversy, issues such as the Hong Kong protest, the pandemic happened, their source of information very much still, at least big part of it, was from their Weibo, their WeChat, the traditional apps, the more very much siloed sources they live in. And although now in the past few months especially, we see more and more, not only Chinese industry, but also government state media are moving on to especially the likes of YouTube and Twitter more and more into the traditional Western social media platforms. But luckily or unluckily, there still seems to be a limitation. And one commentator, who's a senior commentator in Hong Kong, once told me the Chinese government propaganda machine is irresistible when it's within China, or at least within what they call the Sinosphere, the Chinese-speaking world. It's irresistible. They definitely dominate and sway the public opinion. And but when it's in the international domain, especially in the English-speaking or the other language spheres, and its influence is still at this very moment limited. And even some of the communists' own officials admit their what they call the international propaganda campaigns are not as successful even as Russia Today. The likes of the Russian social media campaigns are a lot more successful than the Chinese. The Chinese, they admit themselves. And but there's a continued push now in the international social media sphere, such as the Twitter push, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, and lots of other platforms. And how successful would they be? And I guess time will tell. As a journalist, it's a privilege to live in this exciting world to watch. And as Professor Zhang just mentioned, there's a growing ideological confidence within China. And the belief is, somehow this authoritarian system works in a chaotic world. And I think back in history, Mussolini's Italy for a while had that belief. Some Italians friends today still reminiscent of the days when Mussolini built a highway from Rome all the way to the southern tip of Italy within a set time. All the trains ran on time. So those arguments go on. And I'll finish and sum up. Can we move to the next slides, please? And we all know who this person is, and the famous 1984 and Mr. Orwell's predictions now actually helped with artificial intelligence, social media apps are increasingly coming true. His depiction of a dystopian world is actually coming true in China. People who utter any dissent within or even without, if you live in within, are either silenced or actually attacked, and in one way is more than another. Whether that system is right or the liberal democracy we lived in and had thrived over the past few decades are correct, it's up for everybody to debate. And but the facts are here, and I hope this presentation will shed a little bit of light on the current big news topic, why the U.S. government is trying to ban WeChat and some of the other Chinese social media platforms. At least that's one of the arguments behind, is that it's extending the Chinese government's push, a propaganda push, and monitoring overseas. Okay.
Howard, thank you for that. I just wanted to encapsulate what you said there, because you talked about the Sinosphere. So is it the case then that the Chinese diaspora communities in Vancouver and London, Los Angeles, wherever in the world, working on WeChat, are then living in that Chinese intranet and getting that information and the sort of seeping in of soft power thinking, that Orwellian soft power thinking, wherever they are in the world?
Exactly. To give an example, a student living in London, to make some extra cash, and instead of trying to set up something on Amazon, the easiest way for him or her is actually to set up a small shop on WeChat, because they know the way, what people want or what people don't want, and they can easily set up a e-commerce business on WeChat, and before you know, they go back to the whole environment and all the transactions are done with WeChat Pay or Alipay, and there's no exchange almost with the current environment they're staying in. It's still back within the greater China sphere.
Yeah, so that's why Donald Trump wants to ban it. There's a question that's come in here. I want to put it to Professor Zheng to begin with, and then branch it out to the panel. Are we wrong in talking about the rise of China? And should we instead be talking about the rise of Asia? Because there are different values, aren't they? And they're talking about Chinese values. Is it Asian values? Should we be looking at the whole region when we're discussing this? Just as briefly as you can, because I want everybody to take a punt at this question.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be very challenging for me to be brief. As academic, we are very interested in concepts. So first of all, probably in China, people won't call it the rise of China. They will call it the revival of China because it's believed in national great rejuvenation. It's believed that China was the world #1, and now it's just coming back to its place. It's not the rise of China. I think Charlie's briefly mentioned about whether there was a world center, whether China was to be that or not. That's a different separate questions. Secondly, when you mean about Asian values, I think I will be very cautious in using that term because Asia is such a big place, and Korean, Japanese, Pakistan, India, they all have very different values. So I will be very cautious in calling it the rise of Asia. I think probably you can say the rise of non-Western power in general.
Okay.
I think that's probably a better term I will use.
Okay, T. Stams, could you have a go at answering that? Are we right at concentrating on China? Should we concentrate on Asia? I think you might be muted.
Sorry, that was silly. No, I think we are. Well, there's two sides of it. I think Europe would do well to, first of all, it should focus on China because it has the Chinese state has in that sense, a unique capability of fostering enormous economic growth and therefore a bigger position on the world stage, and to translate that into real geopolitical influence, where other Asian countries like Korea or Japan, for various reasons, are limited to an extent that China isn't. We might as well also consider India a similar a player of a similar geopolitical magnitude, I guess. So it's not just China, but in that sense, China does have a unique position. But I think Professor Zheng is very right in saying that we should focus on the post-Western rather than the rise of Asia. Not only because, and Professor Zheng, I think very rightfully says that, because Asia is hardly a construct that has so huge and diverse that it has very little, perhaps, practical value as a unit of analysis in international relations. But mostly, I think, because it pinpoints not just to a geographic shift, but rather to this period in time where values initiated by the West will be put to the test, and we should see whether they really are universal or indeed have a very limited cultural stretch. So I think, in that sense, the post-Western is right on the money.
Post-Western is the one. Charlie, could I bring you in for a question that I think you're apt to answer? It's answering Professor Zheng's things. China's challenge is not unique. Is it Donald Trump and America that is actually the bigger threat to the international order?
I think they're both threats, if I may say so. But in terms of size, Donald Trump will either be out of power in a few weeks' time or limited to another 4 years. Either way, he's not going to be a permanent threat, I don't think. And I maintain an optimism that America will return to the sort of values and systems that it had before Trump. So, whereas I don't share that confidence that China will return to values that it may have had before, whenever we define before. Can I just answer a couple of other quick points very
Yes.
briefly? On the last question, I think definitely we must treat China as different from Asia. In the economic sphere, South Korea, Japan, and other countries arose well before. But don't forget, they're very much smaller. So I think you have to treat China as rise as a very different phenomenon. If you look at military, I think there's a difference there in terms of the threat that China is undoubtedly posing to the region and possibly later to the world. The values, very different indeed. And indeed, Chinese values certainly aren't Asian values, but we should also talk about Communist Party values as opposed to Chinese values. Because
there's these two, there's the Chinese cultural values and the Communist Party political values then.
Well, I mean, let's for instance, I mean, Hong Kong is a Chinese society. Taiwan is in many ways, but they do not share in any way the values that the Communist Party shares. And finally, you get down to the politics, very different indeed. So, and just one comment on that, which Professor Zhang put out on the confidence of the system. I query the confidence of a system that has a vast array of surveillance, that spends more on its internal suppression than it does on its external military, that sees no end to the need to blame hostile foreign forces as though these are responsible for all China's ills. Hostile foreign forces, which incidentally are able to mobilize 1 million people onto the streets of Hong Kong. I think that's remarkably patronizing for Hong Kong. They don't need Western forces to do that. And I think a confident society, political society, would not need the array of censorship and the secrecy and the lack of transparency that's in China. So no, I don't think it's a confident society or political system. I think it's actually a very fragile one, which is why they take all those measures that they have.
Thank you. I just want to go to Howard and then Professor Zheng with some more questions that went in. Howard, on the WeChat thing that you gave, the decoupling, this is the sort of separation. It's both economic and everything like that. Apart from the WeChat element, what needs to be separated off, they're asking, to have an effective decoupling of these two great powers?
The main worry, if you talk to UK and US, specialists, security specialists, and online safety specialists, it's mainly about the control of data. Because even here in the West, we have great worries over the FANG, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Googles, their control of billions of people's free-flowing personal information. And they're under the rule of law of our liberal democracy that's already sort of guaranteed and enshrined in many ways. Even that we worry how they abuse these. And there were scandals before. And that the big worry here is if you do not cut off the data supply and at least remove even the potential of the Chinese government getting their hands on the data, so personal data, you do not know what they were used for. And just a few weeks back, we have this small news coming out of Shenzhen. It basically a NGO, I believe is somewhere in Australia, found that there's a database in a small company called Zhenhua in Shenzhen, who essentially used open source data they collected from all the social media around the world, and then put up personal profiles of what they consider important individuals all around the world, and painted pictures, what they like, who they are. And I'm not saying, I have an opinion on either they should or should not do that, but these are the potential, and that's just one company. And if WeChat collects information from every aspect of an individual's life, from what you eat in the morning to who you sleep with in the evening, and what taxi you take, and what type of things you watch or read online.
Dangerous to us all, yes.
If that information is all routed back into a giant server, and the officials in Beijing, if they want, can have access to it, that's, I guess, the major danger people are looking at. And I think that's the American argument why they want to at least stop that type of things from happening.
Strong argument. Thank you for that, Howard. I just want to finish off with a question to Professor Zhang. It's a general question that's come in, but I think that's given where you are and your efforts to get to us, if you could answer it in 1 minute. Who does China want to win the presidential election, Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
Well, that's a very good question. I think if you ask different Chinese people, probably they will tell you very different answers. So far, I think they are very different. Depends on what do you mean? Because
can I rephrase it? Who does the Chinese Communist Party want to win the election?
Again, the Chinese Communist Party is the largest organization in the world. They have millions of members, and they have very different views of that. So the different Chinese Communist Party member I talked to, some of them probably want Trump. They believe that in the long run, it's going to make America weaker and weaker, and it's going to fundamentally destroy the moral high ground of the American liberal democracy. But some of them, they will probably prefer Biden. They believe that Biden and probably the Democrats is going to be more reasonable. They don't have any illusion that there'll be less pressure from the US, but they hope that they'll be able to deal with someone who really makes sense and talk to reasons. So I would say very divided views.
So the pressure the same, perhaps more polite and courteous than by the Trump tweets. Thank you, everybody there. We're now going to go to Barry Gardner, who sent through it's a video. It's a video wrapping up the situation that we discussed from his viewpoint, and then back to me again to a thanks to all the panelists. So Barry Gardner, the screen is yours.
There's a line in a Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, that says, "I could say elves to him, but I'd rather he said it for himself." The poem is all about the process of repairing a dry stone dike as two farmers go up on either side of their wall, replacing the missing stones that have fallen to their own side as they go. And it concludes with the line, "Good fences make good neighbors." We could say UNCLOS to the Chinese, but we'd rather they said it for themselves. In 2016, an arbitral tribunal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea ruled that the Spratly Islands and the Scarborough Shoal Reef were unable to support human habitation on their natural state, and therefore China could not establish an exclusive economic zone around them. This means that the vast majority of the resources in the South China Sea belong to the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So China invented the notion of joint development as a way of pressurizing its neighbors to concede a share of the resources the international order had conclusively established were not theirs. But the 2016 ruling didn't take a position on who should have sovereignty in the area, and the UK has stopped short of taking a position on sovereignty whilst calling on China to accept the ruling. The West, you see, doesn't really want to get too involved in a local dispute as long as its freedom to navigate through the South China Sea is not impaired. And to that end, the US has been sending naval ships into the area to uphold this right. China claims that it supports the principle, provided its territorial waters are not violated. For decades, China's foreign policy has emphasized non-intervention in internal domestic matters. As such, you might imagine that China would have voted against the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which introduced the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. But in fact, at its first practical test in Resolution 1973, when the UN authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians in Libya, China did not oppose the resolution. But it'd be an understatement to say that the Libyan operation was no great success, and China's non-intervention policy has strengthened since then, most notably in its cooperation with Russia to block intervention in the Syrian government's abuse of its own citizens. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee in Parliament said this: "This reflects China's acute concerns about state sovereignty and what it sees as the right of governments to maintain order. The FCO noted that although China's preference for consensus means it has used its veto less often than any other P5 member, 8 of its 11 vetoes as of January 2018 have come since 2007, and the last 6 related to Syria. But when it comes to the UN, China continues to support the UN as an institution. It is the UN's third largest donor after the US and Japan, and this is important at a time when the UN is facing budgetary shortfalls. China is also the second highest contributor to the UN peacekeeping budget and the largest contributor of peacekeeping forces among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. China's advocated the return of 6-party talks to try and solve the North Korean nuclear crisis, yet it's been accused of not using enough of the considerable economic leverage it holds over North Korea to effect change, and of course it's said to have watered down the UN resolutions on the subject. So China was also a supporter of the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal, which President Trump has since withdrawn from. And just last month, there were reports that China and Iran are negotiating a strategic partnership that contains security elements. So let's move to human rights, because they're an area of huge concern to Western sensibilities. The UK has, of course, been intimately focused on Hong Kong, but also the treatment of the Uyghurs, and going back historically, you would have to include Tibet. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee looked at the issue of China and human rights, and interestingly it noted, we have sympathy with the argument that China's extraordinary economic achievements represent a form of progress on human rights in itself. And when defending its human rights record in December last year, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated, "The Chinese people have the best say in the human rights situation in China. Over the past 70 years, the Chinese nation has found its feet and become prosperous and strong. The Chinese government integrates the principle of universality of human rights with national conditions. We have ensured enough food and clothing for nearly 1.4 billion people, cut impoverished population by 850 million, provided employment for 770 million people, and offer basic security to 250 million elderly, 85 million persons with disabilities, and more than 60 million persons that receive urban or rural minimum living subsidies. We've made a historic leap from poverty to adequate food and clothing, and to a moderately prosperous society for around 1.4 billion people. Besides, we have developed the largest national education system, the largest social security system, the largest medical system, and the largest community-level democracy system in the world, which composes an epic of China's human rights progress." That's what they had to say about their own human rights situation and their perception of it. And despite its impressive economic growth, it appears that the Chinese Communist Party is desperately worried about the consequences of unfettered popular debate, and it's afraid to subject itself to domestic scrutiny. As a result, Beijing faces the uneasy task of managing a huge and complex economic system without the public input and debate that political freedom allows. In the absence of elections, the government's legitimacy then depends largely on a growing economy. They worry that slowing economic growth will increase demands from the public in China for more say in how they're governed. And the result has been to close down civic groups and independent journalism, online conversation curtailed, ethnic and religious minorities who have or express different or higher allegiances face severe persecution. And the rule of law has been replaced by the Communist Party rule by law. In such a scenario, it's inevitable that one country, two systems is seen by them as a threat to be extinguished, not an experiment to be learned from. Is it any wonder then that China has attempted to redefine the issue of human rights in order to avoid its criticism? And in December 27, Xi Jinping hosted the South-South Human Rights Forum in Beijing, with more than 300 representatives from 70 countries. The forum resulted in a statement labeled the Beijing Declaration, which stated that each country should choose a human rights development path or guarantee model that suits its specific conditions. This represents their alternative vision of human rights as not universal, but specific to national circumstances. At China's Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council in November 2018, the UK noted that political and civil rights in China had deteriorated and said that it was very concerned about the treatment of ethnic minorities, including actually the Uyghurs and Tibetans. But China rejected the criticisms and has taken an increasingly activist role as the on the Human Rights Council to ensure that its interests are protected, enlisting other countries' support for its positions and trying to deflect criticism. In the arena of trade, China has been guilty of illegal dumping and unfair state subsidy, as well as not respecting intellectual property rights. But I have to say, in relation to the WTO, it's hard to maintain the accusation that it has tried to undermine the global order. On the contrary, it's been loudly supportive of the international order. In January this year, China supported the EU's efforts to create a temporary mechanism to settle trade disputes after the US refusal to appoint rendered the WTO's appellate body inoperable. And Zhang Zhanchen, China's ambassador to the WTO, actually marked the occasion by wearing the black tie that he said his wife had given him for funerals, and called America's action in letting the lights goes out at the appellate body, he said, the most severe blow to the multilateral trading system since its establishment. On the environment, China has ratified the Paris Agreement on climate change that the US has pulled out of. Although China has not set targets to cut absolute emissions, it has pledged to bring emissions to a peak by around 2030. And for many years, it's been cooperating with the EU on climate change, engaging in regular high-level discussions, and it has established 7 separate carbon trading schemes domestically. It's possible to say that its response has again been driven by domestic unrest as the problem of air pollution became reminiscent of London's Great Smog. But it's difficult to maintain that it's undermining the global order in respect of the environment. So let's look at containment. If China's adherence to the rules-based international system is selective, prioritizing certain rules in favor of others, how should we respond? Do we build a wall, isolate and sanction them for their bad decisions, or do we identify areas of mutual strategic interest to try to draw China further into the global rules-based order and leverage China as a constructive player that potentially also contributes to improvements? Yukon Huang, writing for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has suggested that if there is a basis for forging a more constructive relationship, it'll likely come from China's dependency on a rule-based multilateral system to become a more prosperous and innovative great power. By recognizing China's needs, he says the US can forge a new strategy of engagement that would benefit both nations. But Robert Frost put it this way: before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly. And I'd rather he said it for himself.
Thank you, Barry Gardner, giving us the strand of subjects, topics, and issues of which China does cooperate, and those which could be in contention, which is all about building some form of unified world order. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for partaking in the discussion, your comments and questions that have come in. Thank you, the panelists, for taking part, and your credits are on a roll, because I've seen it, that comes after this. I'd just like to say that the magazine that's attached to Democracy Forum, Asian Affairs, has now launched its own app that you can get in the Apple Store now. Just to search Asian Affairs and you can download that and get the magazine. And there is another seminar being put together at the moment. The title is, Does China Have a Legal, Moral and Historical Right over Tibet? That is going to take place sometime in October with an equally incisive set of panelists. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, the panel, and goodbye from London.